What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, I'm going to show you how Magnus Carlsen uses the Italian opening as white to play for a win against 5 of the strongest grandmasters in the world, including Hans Niemann, Hikaru Nakamura, Alireza Firouzja, Wesley So, and finally Vishy Anand. Now, to kick things off, we have the game Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann from the 2022 Charity Cup Tournament. And here, Magnus opens 1e4 best by test. Hans Niemann responds 1e5. Then knight to f3, attacking the pawn on the e5 square. Knight to c6 defends the pawn. And finally, the key Italian move, bishop c4. Now, of course, White's idea with the Italian is very simple. He develops the bishop out to this very strong diagonal. He puts immediate pressure on f7, and he prepares castles on the next move. Now, from here, Black's main ideas are to go either knight to f6 or bishop c5 immediately, then the other, and finally short castles on the king side. In the game, Hans Niemann does go knight f6 first. This is the two knights variation. Black's idea is to put pressure on that pawn on the e4 square. Here, Magnus Carlsen defends with the move d3. Then bishop c5 from Hans Niemann. And now here, what Magnus typically likes to do as Magnus is play the moves short castles on the king side, c3 and h3 in some order. It's not super important which one you play first in the Italian. So here, Magnus, he short castles. Hans Niemann does the same. Magnus goes h3, guarding that g4 square, very important. Black goes d6, bolstering the center. And then Magnus plays the final move in his formation, the move c3. Now, so far, Hans Niemann has played all of the most solid and principled moves. Now he does have to make a decision. Here, White is actually threatening the move d4, expanding in the center. And for that reason, Black typically needs to do something about guarding his bishop on the c5 square. So here, the main ideas for Black are going to be a5, gaining space on the queen side, a6. Both of these moves do offer the a7 square as a retreat square for the bishop, or the final idea, besides a5 and a6, is bishop b6 from Black. And don't worry, we're going to cover all of those moves from Black in this series. I'm going to show you exactly what Magnus Carlsen does against all of them. But in this game here, Hans Niemann does play the most popular move today. That is simply a5. Now, the idea behind this move is twofold. First of all, Hans Niemann is giving his bishop that retreat square on the a7 square. Just in case White goes d4, the bishop can go to a7, and it's nice and safe there. On the other hand, this move a5 also gains space on the queen side and stops White's idea of b2 to b4. Of course, there is one drawback of this move. It does give up control of the b5 square. If that pawn was on a6 instead, it would control b5. But now, bishop b5 is a very distinct possibility and a lot of lines for Magnus. Now, from here, Magnus goes rook e1, a very standard developing idea in the Italian. This move guards the e4 pawn, and this does make d4 a very distinct threat. On the prior move, the rook was not defending the pawn, and therefore knight takes e4 was a threat if White went d4 immediately. So rook e1 defending. Your Black goes h6, guarding the g5 square. There are no bishop g5 or knight g5 ideas from White now. And here Magnus Carlsen has a very big choice. The main line in the Italian for White when Black goes a5, it starts with knight d2. Then Black typically goes bishop to e6, challenging the bishop on the c4 square. And here White takes advantage of that weak b5 square, going bishop b5, putting pressure on that knight on c6. So this is the absolute main line, and from here, Black has a whole ton of different ideas. But in the game, instead of knight d2, on move 9, Magnus actually breaks in the center immediately with the move d4. Now, this is a very double-edged idea. Obviously, Magnus getting that beautiful pawn center. However, those pawns will be very vulnerable, and he has to take great care to defend them properly. Now, from here, the bishop is being attacked. Obviously, the most logical ideas are taking on d4, or retreating the bishop back to the b6 or the a7 squares. In the game, Hans Niemann goes bishop b6. However, bishop to a7 was just as good, if not even a little better in this position. Now, from here, Magnus is very concerned about the safety of his pawns, which is a very nice maneuver with his bishop going bishop b3, then bishop c2, bolstering the pawn on the e4 square. So here it is, bishop b3, Black goes rook to e8, increasing the pressure on the e4 pawn. Of course, if Black takes on d4, then that rook wouldn't be attacking the e4 pawn with both the rook and the knight. So for here, Magnus, bishop c2, and now he's defending the pawn with both the bishop and the rook, which counters Black's knight and rook attack on the pawn. Now in this position, Hans Niemann has all of his pieces very well developed, his rook and his knight putting pressure on the center, same thing for his knight and bishop on the queen side. And here he has to find the right plan as black. In the game, he breaks in the center with the move d5, and now we have this pawn square right in the middle of the board. Obviously, all of the pawns are attacking each other. However, this move was a little bit premature, and it gives white the chance to fight for an advantage. Instead of this, there's a very important idea that Hans Niemann did miss in this game. The key idea for black is first you take on d4, and then you jump in with the knight to the b4 square, attacking the bishop on c2. Now, here's the problem for white. He has to keep that bishop alive if he wants to fight for an edge, but here the bishop is defending the pawn on the e4 square. So, for example, if Magnus were to go bishop b3 in this kind of position, then that pawn on e4 does fall to either the rook or the knight. Instead, if white ignores the threat and goes knight to c3, then black is going to simply capture the bishop on the c2 square, and after knight takes c2, then queen takes c2. Without that light squared bishop, it's going to be much harder for white to attack the black king, and black is going to be perfectly fine in this position. Now, of course, going back to the game, Hans Niemann did not see this idea of simply e takes d4 and then knight to b4, winning the bishop on the c2 square. Instead, he goes d5 immediately, and now if black can pull this move off, it's going to be great for him. However, there are tactical problems for black in this position. Here, Magnus finds the best idea for white. He takes on the d5 square, and then after the queen takes back on d5, Magnus goes back bishop b3, targeting the queen with the bishop. So excellent move by Magnus, realizing the bishop now, instead of being better placed on c2, he actually brings it back to the b3 square. And now after queen d6 from Hans Niemann, this is the best move. Now this bishop is very, very active on this diagonal, putting threats against the black king. Now here, Magnus Carlsen is doing excellent. His next big problem is going to be how do you develop those pieces on the queen side, the rook, the knight, and the bishop. He starts with the move knight d2. The knight is very well placed on the d2 square, and of course it also eyes the c4 square. If the knight jumps into c4, it will be eyeing both the queen and the bishop, and that means Hans Niemann is going to have a chance to win the bishop on b6 and potentially ruin black's pawn structure after the move c takes b6. Now, of course, knight d2 is an excellent move. However, knight to a3 is also possible here, with the same idea of going knight to c4 on the next move. Now, back to the game, knight d2 on the board, and here Hans Niemann, he has to find the right plan. In the game, he goes e4, trying to gain space in the center and putting pressure on the knight on the f3 square. However, this was not the best idea for black, and Magnus Carlsen is going to punish this move. Instead, the best move would have been e takes d4, try to liquidate the center a little bit. Here the main line goes rook takes e8, then knight takes e8 is forced. And here, of course, Magnus Carlsen would jump in with the knight to the c4 square. However, once the queen moves, Magnus Carlsen is only going to have a small edge. Overall, black here is still doing relatively okay. Now, back to the game continuation. Here, Hans Niemann did go e4 instead of e takes d4. And now Magnus Carlsen is in a position to punish this. Of course, Magnus does not retreat the knight back to the h2 square. Instead, first, he plays the intermediate move, knight to c4. Of course, the queen is now under attack. E takes f3 is not possible from black. So here, Hans Niemann, he retreats his queen to the d8 square. This is not a square you want to retreat the queen to, but here, queen d8 is actually the best move for black. Real fast, the alternatives are no better. If black goes queen d7 instead, then Magnus Carlsen's move knight to e5 hits the queen with tempo, and that is going to be a disaster for black. Instead, if black goes queen to e7, the problem with this move is the rook now attacks the queen with the x-ray attack, and white can even ignore the threat on the knight and simply go bishop f4, continuing development, putting pressure on c7 in some lines, and here Magnus would have a very big edge. So kudos to Hans Niemann finding the best move, queen d8, getting the queen out of trouble. However, now this move is a little bit passive. Now here, Magnus plays the most aggressive idea, knight to e5, jumping forward with the knight, an excellent move. And of course, this was part of the idea of knight to c4 earlier. Here, black takes the knight with his knight. White can recapture with the knight on c4 or even the pawn on the d4 square and defend it with the other knight. Now from here, Hans Niemann goes bishop to e6, a solid developing move, putting pressure on that knight and the bishop indirectly on the b3 square. And here Magnus has a big choice. How do you want to continue putting on the pressure on Hans Niemann? Well, here Magnus Carlsen is actually spoiled for choice. He has so many different good options that he can choose from. Here the computer seems to love the idea of knight takes c6, try to damage black's pawn structure on the queen side. However, there were a variety of other moves he could also play. For example, bishop to a4 is good, putting pressure on that knight on c6, and of course pinning the knight to the rook on e8. And beyond that, there's even the idea of knight to g4. This move puts pressure on that knight on f6, and if black takes the knight on g4, white can actually recapture with the h-pawn. H takes g4. This is a very common idea in the closed variation of the Ruy Lopez, and here that pawn can act as a battery ram, try to ram up the board and open black's king side with the move g5, threatening g takes h6. Now, in the game, Magnus didn't choose any of these options. Again, he was spoiled for choice. Instead, he goes bishop to f4 in this position, just trying to further bolster that knight on the e5 square. Now here, Hans Niemann, his best idea as black is probably going to be trading some pieces. Knight takes e5, looks like a good move, trying to get some of the pieces off the board. However, instead of that, here Hans Niemann goes knight to d5 instead. The idea behind this move is very simple. He wants to put pressure on that bishop on the f4 square. That bishop is now hanging. However, here Magnus spots an absolutely brilliant tactical idea. Of course, the obvious move for white is going to be rook takes e4, but the problem with that move is it potentially runs into the move f5 from black. At that point, the rook would have to move, and then that bishop on f4 would be hanging. Now, this may still be a good move. There's a lot of tactics going on here. So if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the best move for Magnus Carlsen in this position. Well, I hope you found it. If you did, kudos to you, my friend. Here, the best move and the one Magnus plays in the game is actually rook takes e4. He takes the pawn and he runs right into black's trap with the move f5. Now, of course, if white retreats the rook to e1, then knight takes f4 is going to win the bishop. So Magnus must have a different idea here. Well, here's the idea. First of all, knight takes c6. This move does put pressure on the queen on d8, therefore black has to take back on the c6 square. Now here, what is Magnus Carlsen's idea? Obviously, rook to e1 is not the move. Well, in the game, he actually gives up the rook for the bishop on the e6 square. Rook takes e6 is the move. Then black takes back the rook. And here we have a very imbalanced position. White gave up the rook in exchange for a pawn and the bishop. However, beyond that, he has completely damaged black's pawn structure on the queen side. This pawn on f5 is incredibly weak. White also has long-term pressure on both the rook on e6 and the king on g8 with that bishop on the g3 square. And from here, white's other pieces are excellently placed. The knight could jump into the e5 square. The queen could jump into h5 very, very soon. And overall, black is under a tremendous amount of pressure in this position. Now here, Magnus Carlsen moves the bishop to the e5 square, trying to put pressure on that g7 pawn and also blocking the e-file here. Of course, black has those two rooks, so anything Magnus Carlsen can do to make those rooks weaker is going to be to his benefit. Now, Hans Niemann, he's a fighter. He goes queen to g5, bringing out the queen, putting pressure on white's king side. Now, queen to f3 from Magnus, of course, developing the queen and giving the rook a path to get into the game on the d1 or even better, the e1 square. Now, in this position, black's best move is going to be simply king to h7, getting his king off this diagonal here with the bishop. If he doesn't do that, there's going to be a lot of different tactics that Magnus Carlsen could exploit. And fortunately for us, Hans Niemann did not find this move. That means I get to show you all sorts of really cool ideas here. In the game, Hans Niemann goes rook d8. This move looks logical, developing the rook on the d-file. However, again, black had to get his king off this diagonal. And here's why. In the game, Magnus Carlsen takes the bishop on b6. Knight takes b6. Then c takes b6 is forced. And here, Magnus Carlsen goes c4, try to knock the knight off that d5 square, and once the knight moves, his plan is going to be c5, opening up the bishop's line of attack with the rook and the king. Now, for example, if black simply retreats the knight, knight e7, then Magnus Carlsen's idea probably was c5, then knight d5 is forced, try to block that diagonal, but then c takes b6 is the move. And here, white wins a free pawn as that knight on the d5 square is still pinned, and now Magnus has two pawns, plus an attack, plus the bishop for the rook, and he is just dominating this position. Now, instead of knight to e7, Hans Niemann finds a much stronger idea in the game. Here, he actually gives up his rook on the e5 square for the bishop. Rook takes e5 is the move. So Hans Niemann giving back the exchange to Magnus Carlsen, and here's why. After d takes e5, winning the rook, black goes knight to f4, and here Magnus only has one pawn. Black also has various knight takes h3 threats in the future, and Hans Niemann felt this was a better idea in the game versus the passive defense after knight d7. However, of course, Magnus Carlsen is on his A game in this game. Here he goes c5, opening up the check against the black king and threatening c takes b6 in the future. Now, king h7 from Hans, and here Magnus spots a beautiful tactical idea, h4. The idea behind this move is actually very simple. First of all, the queen has to stay defending the knight on the f4 square. His only squares he can go to with the queen are g4 or to take the pawn on the h4 square. Here black goes queen g4 with the queen, then white simply takes the queen, black takes back, and then c takes b6 is the move, and now Magnus is up 2 pawns with a very dominant position in the endgame. However, the alternative move, queen takes h4, surprisingly isn't any better. Here Magnus Carlsen spots the key move, g3, forking both the queen on h4 and the knight on the f4 square. Of course, Hans Niemann spots the best move, knight to h3, getting the knight out of the attack of the pawn with check. Good idea. But then after king g2, once again black has a hard time. The queen is being attacked, and if the queen moves back, say to g5 or e7, then the knight on the h3 square is going to fall. So Hans Niemann does his best to defend. Instead of those moves, he goes queen to g4. Excellent idea. After queen takes, f takes, that knight is still defended. However, his pawn structure now is a little bit weaker on the king side. Here, Magnus takes on the b6 square. C takes b6 is the move. Now, Magnus is once again up a full pawn. However, his pawn structure is much better. He has those passed pawns on the e5 and the b6 squares, and this position is going to be very difficult for black to defend. From here, Hans Niemann goes knight to g5, the idea being trying to get his knight back into the game and try to guard the e6 square, but Magnus Carlsen does not let up. His main plan here is to simply push those passed pawns down the board as quickly as he can. Here, e6 is the move. And then after king g6, he actually goes e7. This move is brilliant because after rook e8, rook e1 is the move from Magnus. Now he has the rook supporting the pawn, and that rook on the e8 square is basically forced to stay there. If it moves, then this pawn over here is going to promote, or the pawn on the e file will promote. Now black goes knight to f3, trying to counterplay. Magnus Carlsen, rook to e3. Of course, the knight was attacking the rook on the e1 square. Then knight d4, threatening the bishop on b3. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he simply ignores the threat. He goes b7. Of course, now the threat is b8 promoting. If black takes the pawn, then e8 promotes to a queen here, and then Magnus will win the rook. After rook takes e8, then rook takes e8 from Magnus. So with that in mind, here black goes knight to f5. Again, trying to put more pressure on that pawn on the e7 square. But here, the winning move from Magnus is simply rook e6 check. Of course, the idea after the king moves anywhere, say to h7 or to f7, Magnus will play the move rook takes c6. The threat here is simply rook to c8 next, and this pawn on the b7 square is going to promote one way or the other. All right, in the second game, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Hikaru Nakamura from the 2020 Carlsen Tour Finals. So here, Magnus facing off against his longtime rival, Hikaru Nakamura. And this game is absolutely incredible. So white here with the Italian move, bishop to c4. And in the last game, Hans Niemann did go knight to f6, the two nice defense. Here instead, Hikaru goes bishop c5. Very solid move. White castles, black goes knight to f6, threatening the pawn on the e4 square. And here, white goes d3, and we have the same position we had in the Hans Niemann game on move 5. White, of course, just bolstering the pawn on the e4 square. Now from here, black goes d6, bolstering his pawn center on the e5 square. White goes c3, threatening a future d4. And here we have the first big deviation from the prior game. In this position, black actually goes h6, instead of short castles on the king side. Now, the idea behind this move is obvious. White, on all of these moves, is threatening the idea of bishop g5. It's a very playable option for white. Here, black is clamping down on the g5 square, stopping it permanently. However, in this position, whenever black goes for a very early h6 in the Italian, especially before castles, then white is going to have the option of going for a very good version of a bird's attack with the move b4, expanding on the queen side. So, for example, if Magnus did go for this, it's quite strong in this position. the main line goes b4, bishop b6 is forced, then white goes a4, expanding further on the queen side. Then black typically goes a5, stopping a5 ideas from white, winning the bishop. White's going to go b5, knight e7, then knight d2. And from here, white is a very good position. He is threatening ideas like h3, rook e1, d4, and overall his extra space on the queen side does seem to give him a slight edge in this position. So b4 was a very playable idea in this position with the early h6 from Hikaru, but instead Magnus simply goes rook to e1, continuing developing in this game. Now from here, Hikaru does castle, gets his king to safety, and here if Magnus went h3, we'd have an invitation to the prior game, after the moves a5, then d4. Again, same moves we saw in the Hans Niemann game. Instead, in this game, Magnus Carlsen does mix things up. He goes knight d2 in this position. Now, this is a very normal move. However, Magnus does have a unique idea tied with this move. Here, Hikaru goes a5, again gaining space on the queen side, stopping b4 ideas for white, and setting up that bishop to a7 retreat square if he needs it. And here Magnus shows his idea. Instead of playing in the center right away, trying to go for a fast d4 break, or instead of going for a fast bishop b5, putting pressure on the knight, here he just goes knight to f1. Magnus Carlsen's idea is very simple. He wants to go knight g3, and from there, that knight will do a wonderful job of bolstering the e4 square, and from there, I'll be ready for a d4 advance breaking in the center. Now, the one drawback of this move, knight to f1, is that it is a little bit slow. It doesn't put a whole lot of pressure on black's position immediately, and for that reason, black has a whole host of different options that he could play in this position. So, for example, bishop b6 or bishop a7 is very playable, getting out of the way of a future d4 advance from white. Beyond that, there's the move knight to e7, the idea being you want to reroute the knight to the g6 square next, then perhaps go c6 and d5. Or finally, there's the option Hikaru played in the game, and that is simply bishop to e6, challenging white's bishop on the c4 square. Now here, of course, Magnus does have the option of simply exchanging the bishops on the e6 square. This would double black's pawns on the e-file. However, these double pawns aren't that weak, and this e6 pawn does a great job of controlling those critical d5 and f5 squares. So with that in mind, instead, here Magnus plays the strongest move, simply bishop b5, trying to put pressure on that knight on the c6 square. Now here again, black has a wide variety of options. Those bishop retreats are still in play. He can even go bishop d7, trying to bolster the knight, but instead he goes for the other option, knight to e7, and from here black's plan is going to include knight g6, and perhaps c6 and d5, trying to fight for the center. Now here, Magnus, he senses an opportunity. He knows that knight is no longer on the c6 square, is no longer controlling d4, and with that in mind, here Magnus immediately breaks in the center before going knight to g3, trying to fight to the middle of the board right away. Now this is definitely the strongest move for white, and real fast I want to show you why. If Magnus Carlsen did go knight g3 here, this move is a little bit too slow, and it does give black a very interesting idea of expanding on the queen side. So for example, here black could simply go c6. Now the best move from white is bishop a4, and here black could further expand on the queen side with moves like b5, and then after bishop c2, the move a4. Now, of course, white is still doing great here. He can still go d4, trying to break in the center. However, overall, this is just another option Magnus did not want to give Hikaru in the game, and for that reason, his move on move 11 was, of course, the move d4, expanding in the middle of the board. Now here, black has a big choice. The main options are going to include retreating the bishop back to the b6 square, bishop to a7, or taking on the d4 square. Now, in the game, Hikaru did take on d4. There's nothing super wrong with bishop b6 or bishop a7. It's just a little bit slower, and white could follow up with either d takes e5 or d5 at some point in this game. So, of course, e takes d4, the move for Hikaru, a very active move. White takes back, c takes d4, and now Hikaru retreats the bishop to b6. Now, you may be wondering, what is the difference between black going bishop b6 versus bishop to a7 in this position? Well, there aren't too many differences. One of the main ideas, though, is if black goes c6 in the future, and when you have the bishop on the b6 square, there will be the option of going bishop c7, retreating the bishop back towards the middle of the board. While on the other hand, if you go bishop to a7 as black, or if you face it as white, then you are committing this bishop to this diagonal here for the foreseeable future. It's going to be very hard for black to go bishop b8 and somehow get it back into the game on this diagonal. So both moves very playable. It just kind of depends on the circumstances which one you want to do. In the game, bishop b6 from Hikaru. Now Magnus jumps in with the knight, knight g3. d3, the whole point of his knight f1 maneuver in the first place. And here Hikaru, he decides it is time to break in the center himself. He goes d5 immediately. Now, this is an excellent move from Hikaru. Here, if white takes on the d5 square, then he's going to be left with a very weak d4 pawn without the best attacking chances. So with that in mind, instead of that, here he simply expands in the center, going e5 and attacking the knight on the f6 square. So where is the knight going to go? Well, if it retreats, say to h7 or d7, that would be a very passive retreat, a very passive position overall for Hikaru. So instead of that, he actually jumps into the e4 square with the knight. Now, this move looks quite scary for black. I mean, after all, white can simply win the pawn on the e4 square with knight takes and then rook takes. So what is black's idea if Magnus does that? Well, it turns out black here has the very strong idea of simply c5, expanding on the queen side. And here's why this move is so good. First of all, that pawn is pinned. White cannot take the pawn on c5 because his d4 pawn is pinned to the queen. If he does that, then queen takes d1, literally wins the game on the spot. White loses queen. So, of course, that is not an option. However, if white doesn't do that, then this pawn on d4 is going to fall, and black's suddenly going to get some counterplay against the weak white center. So overall, knight takes e4 would have been the strongest move in this position, but it's also very playable for black. Hikaru definitely knows what he's doing in this game. However, in this game, Magnus doesn't want those complications. Instead, he simply goes bishop d3, trying to keep some of the tension in the game. Now, from here, obviously, white is threatening knight takes e4, then bishop takes e4. That's going to be quite good for white, so with that in mind, Hikaru simply takes the knight on the g3 square, knight takes g3, and then h takes g3 from white. Now, finally, the dust has settled a little bit. This is a great time to slow down and talk strategy. Obviously, the main factor in this position is white's central pawns. He has that extra pawn on the e5 square. That gives him a space advantage in the center and arguably a space advantage on the king side. For that reason, Magnus is going to attack on the king side, trying to pose threats against black's king. Meanwhile, black, on the other hand, is going to try to defend and perhaps get some counterplay going on the queen side, and his main way to do that will be the move c5. However, he could also advance a4, perhaps even threatening a3 at some point. Now, how is Magnus going to get threats going against Hikaru's king in this position? Well, the main idea for white, of course, is going to be getting a battery on this diagonal. For example, if Magnus goes bishop to c2 and then queen d3, he would threaten checkmate in one move on the h7 square. If Magnus pulls that off, black may be forced to go g6 trying to defend, but that, of course, would weaken the h6 pawn, and this bishop on c1 could threaten it outright. So overall, that is Magnus Carlsen's main plan, and of course, Hikaru is going to try to expand on the queen side to get counterplay. Now, in this position, the best move for Hikaru is queen d7. The idea behind this, he wants to set up ideas of either bishop to f5 or bishop to g4. If the bishop goes to f5, that would immediately challenge white's bishop on the d3 square, stopping this whole battery attack idea, which is white's main way of attacking in the position. However, instead of queen d7, Hikaru goes for a very interesting idea of expanding on the queen side with the move a4. Now, what is Hikaru's idea behind this move? Well, let's find out. Here, Magnus goes bishop c2. By far the best move, a good multi-purpose move, both putting pressure on the pawn on a4, and if Hikaru is not careful, he'd have queen d3 ideas, threatening checkmate in one move on the h7 square. So what does Hikaru have in mind? Well, here, instead of defending with the move queen d7, that was arguably the strongest idea once again, defending the pawn and setting up bishop f5 ideas. Here, Hikaru actually goes further with the pawn. He plays it all the way to the a3 square. Now, this is a very common idea in grandmaster chess. Grandmasters nowadays just love to push their A-pawns and their H-pawns all the way down the board, whether they're playing as white or as black. However, here, this move looks a little bit suspicious. Obviously, white can simply take the pawn on the A3 square, and that is what Magnus does in the game. Of course, beyond that, moves like B3 or even B4 are also perfectly playable for Magnus. Instead, b takes a3 on the board, and here Hikaru was trying to argue that the open a-file for the rook offsets the pawn deficit. Of course, white's pawns are doubled on the a-file. However, Magnus seems to disagree. Here Hikaru goes bishop g4, activating the bishop, but now Magnus, he plays the very creative move a4. Of course, the idea behind this move is he is setting up bishop to a3 ideas, and from a3, the bishop will be very active on this diagonal, potentially putting pressure on black's knight on e7 and the rook on the f8 square. And again, real fast, queen d3 in this position would have been a little bit premature. Of course, it is the main idea for Magnus in this kind of position. However, here black can simply go bishop to f5, and with that move, he would threaten the queen. As soon as the queen moves, black wins the bishop on c2. And once that bishop falls, it's going to be much, much harder for white to get an attack going against the black king. So obviously, Magnus needs to keep that bishop alive at all costs. So with that in mind, a4 is the move in the game. Now here, Hikaru simply goes queen d7, activating the queen and connecting the rooks on the back rank. Very solid move. And now, of course, if the knight ever moves, black still has that bishop to f5 resource in hand as the queen now controls the f5 square. Now from here, Magnus does go rook to a3, as we discussed, again putting pressure on this diagonal. Hikaru is not a big fan of that. He goes rook e8, getting the rook out of the pin. And now Magnus Carlsen spots a brilliant idea to get the attack going. Again, the key idea with the attack is queen d3, and Magnus spots a beautiful deflection to get that going. Here in this position, he simply takes the knight on the e7 square. Bishop takes e7. Here's the idea. If black takes back with the rook, that's going to mess with his coordination a little bit. The rook needs to stay on the back rank for defensive purposes. However, now after queen takes e7, of course, the queen and the knight are no longer controlling f5, meaning bishop f5 ideas are not possible. And with that in mind, here Magnus simply goes queen d3, threatening queen h7, and then queen to h8 checkmate after the king moves. So what is Hikaru going to do about this threat? Well, obviously, first of all, king to f8 does not work. If black does that, white simply goes queen h7, again threatening queen h8 checkmate all the same. Not a very good idea for black. Instead, he does go g6 in this position, so it's a decent move. Of course, the bishop is no longer alive for white on the c1 square. That means bishop takes h6 ideas are not possible. However, Magnus does find a way to increase the pressure on the king side all the same, and he does that with the move knight to h4. Now, just look at this position. You don't have to be a chess expert to realize white is threatening some sort of sacrifice on the g6 square. And right now, of course, the idea is simply knight takes g6, then recapturing with the queen if black captures with the pawn from f7. Now here Hikaru is already getting in a little bit of trouble. He has to find a way to counterplay and distract white from this attack. What is he supposed to do? Well, in the game, he goes queen b4, an excellent move, putting pressure on that d4 pawn. Now, if that pawn on d4 falls, then the pawn on e5 will be at risk of falling also, and all of a sudden, white's entire position starts to collapse. So, what is Magnus Carlsen supposed to do here? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the best move for Magnus Carlsen in this position. All right, if you found it, kudos to you, my friend. Of course, the best move here is knight takes g6, sacrificing the knight. Now that the queen has gone away from the defense of the king side, this move is especially strong. Now here, of course, if black takes back with the pawn, that is going to be suicide. White simply takes the pawn on g6. Then after, say, king to f8 or king h8, white simply wins that bishop on g4. And here, white gains 2 pawns. Black's king is incredibly exposed. I mean, this is just a complete disaster for black. So, of course, black did not play this. Instead, on move 24, instead of f takes g6, he immediately counterattacked with the move queen takes d4. Now this move is very, very strong. Here black is threatening to trade queens on the d3 square. He's also threatening queen takes f2 check, so a very good multi-purpose offensive and defensive move from Hikaru. Now here Magnus has a big decision. What the heck do you do about all this tension with the queens in the middle of the board? Well, first of all, what happens if you take the queen on d4? If you take the queen, this is actually really bad for white. Black simply takes back, and now there's all this pressure on the center. Here the knight on g6 has to move, is being attacked, knight to f4, and now white's rook on the a1 square is actually hanging. Black can win it, bishop takes a1, rook takes, and then black can even win the pawn on e5 if he so chooses. Now in this position, black is up a pawn, and white has very weak double pawns on the a file and double pawns on the g file. Overall, Magnus Carlsen does not want this as white. Instead, in this position, he finds a much stronger idea. He actually ignores the threat of queen takes f2 for now, and instead he jumps in with the knight to the e7 square. Now, this move looks a little bit crazy, but it's absolutely brilliant. It's sort of a deflection move. This knight was in the way of the queen getting to the h7 square, so the knight had to go. And here, that knight is actually not hanging. You cannot take it. For example, if black takes the knight, rook takes e7, then Magnus has a mate in 2 moves. You just go queen to h7, then after king to f8, queen h8 is checkmate. The king literally has no squares as the rook on the e7 square blocks the king. So, of course, rook takes e7 is not viable. That means you have to move the king here. In the game, Hikaru goes king to f8, the best move by far, and now Magnus takes the pawn on the d5 square, knight takes d5. So this is part of the idea. Now the knight does control the e7 square. Obviously, the queen cannot take the knight as the queen on d3 defends it. And if black trades the queens, that's going to be very good for Magnus. So with all that in mind, what is Hikaru supposed to do in this position? Well, the top move according to the computer is the tactical idea, rook takes e5. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, this is just a tactical mess. You really just have to calculate all the best moves from both sides here. It's difficult to explain strategy. From here, the best line for white, knight takes b6, then black trades the queens on d3, queen takes, bishop takes, then black trades the rooks. The rook is hanging, of course. Rook takes e1. Rook takes e1, then c takes b6, winning the knight. And here in this final position, white does have one extra pawn on the king side. However, black is doing relatively okay. He has a very active rook on the a file, hitting white's very weak a pawns. And while white does have some winning chances, Hikaru should be able to hold the draw in this kind of position. Now, going back, Hikaru did not find this idea of rook takes e5 in this position. Instead, he played a very natural-looking move. That was queen takes f2. I mean, what could be more natural than winning a pawn and putting the king in check? Well, the problem with this move is it takes the queen away from the attack of the pawn on the e5 square. And now after king to h2, the king is actually surprisingly safe there. All right, we still have some more moves in this game. Here, Hikaru, rook a8, increasing the pressure on the center, finally activating the rook. And beyond that, of course, pinning the knight on the d5 square to the queen on the d3 square. Now, Magnus, he finds literally the only move to keep the game going. And again, if you like puzzles, great time for a puzzle. Magnus has one move to keep the advantage and keep fighting for a win. All right, hope you found it, my friend. In the game, Magnus goes rook to f1. The best move, very good defensive and offensive idea, trying to knock the queen away from the f2 square. And beyond that, even setting up some sacrificial ideas on the f7 square in the future. Now here, Hikaru takes on e5 with the rook. Good move, trying to overload the pin piece on the d5 square. Of course, the knight still cannot move as the rook is pinning it to the queen, and black threatens rook takes d5 on the next move. However, here, rook takes f2 is the move from Magnus. Black takes on d5. And here, once again, white has only one good move to keep the game going. Another great time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, here, Magnus Carlsen, he has both the rook being attacked by the bishop on the b6 square and the queen being attacked by the rook on d5. There's simply no way to defend both of those pieces. So with that in mind, he actually sacrifices the rook on the f7 square. Rook takes f7 is the move. Now from here, taking the rook is actually incredibly dangerous. For example, if black goes king takes f7, then the idea for white is rook to f1 check, bringing the other rook into the game. Then after king e7, you simply go queen h7 check. And now all of these pieces, your queen, your rook, and your bishop are all working together to attack the black king. Black's position is very, very fragile here. Now, of course, there is a very important idea I do want to point out in this type of position. Here, if it was black's turn to move and white didn't have the check, black would be able to go rook to h5. And because the bishop controls this g1 square, that would actually be checkmate. So although it looks like Magnus is in complete control in this position, Hikaru is still fighting. So after rook to f7, here Hikaru goes rook, king to e8. And once again, Hikaru is technically threatening checkmate in one move with the move rook to h5. So here Magnus, he has to find a series of absolutely flawless moves to secure the victory. One small slip-up will spell disaster. All right, in the game, he continues with the incredible move. Queen takes d5. You're giving up the rook to slow down the attack. Of course, rook to h5 is not possible here because queen takes h5 wins the game for Magnus. So instead of rook to h5, rook takes d5 is the move from black. And now again, Magnus Carlsen has one move to save the game. Literally one move. If you like puzzles, once again, pause the video. I'm going to keep going here. The move for Magnus is the beautiful bishop to g6. Again, a good offensive and defensive idea. The bishop does defend the rook on f7. It also guards the h5 square, stopping rook to h5 ideas. And now, of course, Magnus is threatening all sorts of discovered attacks with the rook. For example, rook to f5, check. The bishop gives the king a check, and the rook threatens to win the rook on the d5 square. So here Hikaru has to move the king. King d8 is the move. Now, rook e1 for Magnus, and here Hikaru makes a big mistake in the endgame. He goes c6. The idea, I think, is to try and bolster the rook on the d5 square. However, here, Magnus simply takes up that pawn on b7. Rook takes b7, threatening the bishop on b6. And again, Black, up until now, still has this idea of that checkmate. However, the bishop perfectly controls the h5 square. Therefore, the bishop has to move bishop c7 from Black, and then Magnus just seals the deal with a series of precise rook moves, rook e8 check, king d7, then rook to h8, threatening the pawn on the h6 square. And here in this position, Hikaru resides, as there is simply no way to stop further losses of material. He's had enough. He's going to be down 3 pawns to Magnus Carlsen. That is just too much even for him. All right, diving into game number 3, we have a good one. It's Magnus Carlsen versus Alireza Firouzja from the 2024 Chess.com Classic, so a very recent game. In the game, Magnus opens 1e4, best by test. And then we have e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, the Italian move, and then knight f6, d3, and bishop to c5 from Black. Now, as promised in this game, we're going to see something a little bit different. Here, Black is going to go for that a6 plan in the slow Italian. Here, White castles. Black goes d6. Once again, bolstering the center with that pawn brigade right there. And then c3 from Magnus. And finally, a6 from Black. And this is another very big line for the Italian game for Black. Of course, the ideas are setting up bishop to a7 ideas. That's very important if White goes d4 in the near future. That bishop needs a retreat square. And beyond that, this move is a little bit more solid than the other move, a5, in this position. So with a6, the main advantage is you still keep control of that b5 square. That means you both have b5 ideas in the future, and bishop b5 is not going to be a problem from White's perspective. Now, of course, this move does have some drawbacks. The big drawback is, unlike a5, it does not stop the b4 advance from White. That means White can gain space on the queen side with moves like b4, a4, maybe even b5 in the near future. Now here, Magnus starts by gaining space on the queen side with the move a4. This is a very common idea for White in this a6 Italian line. Now here, Black simply retreats the bishop to the a7 square, bishop a7 on the board. Of course, both b4 and d4 were being threatened at some point, so bishop a7 makes a lot of sense from Black here. Now, Magnus knight d2, Alireza castles, and here Magnus plays a very prudent move, that is h3. This move is very important to remember in this a6 Italian line. Here, instead of that, if Magnus went rook to e1 first, that is a big mistake. And the problem with this move is Black has the counterblow knight to g4. And here, Black obviously is putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the f2 square. Obviously, White can retreat, but then Black simply goes king to h8, and he is threatening to break f5. This would be very bad for White. Of course, the alternative is rook to e2. This move is a little bit better, but all the same, Black goes king to h8. And here the plan for Black is f5. And even if White goes h3, trying to knock off the knight, Black, funnily enough, can go f5. The idea being after h takes g4, Black recaptures, and he's going to have way too much pressure on that f2 square. And beyond that, of course, the queen is jumping into the h4 square. This is just an absolute disaster for White out of the opening. So instead of that, of course, move h3 played by Magnus, a very important detail to remember in your own games. Now here, Black, rook to e8, and now the standard idea for White is going to be rook to e1. Real fast, I just want to show you the main line in this position. Here, Black typically goes h6, stopping bishop g5 ideas from White in the future. Then White goes b4, expanding on the queen side, and then Black's big idea is bishop to e6, challenging the bishop and being ready to retake with the rook on e6 if White takes. So, for example, Black goes bishop to e6, White typically takes, Black takes back with the rook, and then White will typically go queen to c2. And from here, there's a whole host of different options for both sides. Both sides have lots of different plans. It's a very theoretical position. But of course, this did not happen in the game. Instead, on move 10, Magnus Carlsen went for a very creative idea. That is queen to b3. Now, the idea behind this move is obvious. White is putting pressure on that f7 pawn and also the b7 pawn, stopping bishop e6 ideas from black. Now, of course, the drawback of this move is after black defends the pawn, then he will be threatening knight to a5, and that move will fork both the bishop and the queen. If white allows that, he will lose the light-squared bishop. That is a key attacking piece in his position. So, of course, Magnus does not want to allow that. Here in the game, black simply goes rook to f8. Of course, there were other good moves for black as well. Queen to e7 defends the f7 pawn, but instead, rook to f8 played in the game. It doesn't make too much of a difference which one black plays here. Now, in this position, of course, black is threatening knight to a5. That means white's going to have to do something about it. For example, if white simply goes rook to e1, then knight to a5 on the board, the queen has to retreat. Then after, say, knight takes c4, knight takes c4, white loses the light-squared bishop, and his attacking potential in this position is just significantly lower. Now, with that in mind, what should white do on move 11 instead of rook to e1? Well, there are a couple of options. The first option is simply retreating the queen back to the d1 square. However, that move is not very ambitious. For example, queen d1, then black can go rook to e8, and we're literally back to the position we had at the end of move 9, where white went queen b3 in the first place. So this is not the most ambitious idea. Instead, Magnus Carlsen has a very cool idea up his sleeve. Here he goes a5. And now the rook on the a1 square does control the a5 square, stopping knight to a5 ideas from black. Now, of course, the drawback of this move is a5 is quite committal. White gives up the idea of going b4, then b5, with the pawn on b5 being supported by a pawn on the a4 square. That means it's just going to be a lot harder for him to open the queen side. Now here, what are black's big ideas? Well, he has a couple of main plans. One move is b5, gaining space on the queen side. And even if white takes back, black is going to be perfectly fine capturing with the c-pawn. Now, this move is very playable, but instead, Alireza Firouzja, he's an attacking player, and he went for a much more aggressive move. That is the move knight to h5. This is a very thematic idea for black in these a6 Italian lines. Here, black is threatening the move knight to f4, and that knight is going to be an absolute monster on the f4 square. Of course, black's going to have other ideas like queen to f6, and maybe even g5 intending g4. And as you can see, black's attacking ideas can pile up really fast, and his whole attack, of course, benefits from that bishop on the a7 square, slicing down this diagonal. Now here, Magnus has to start thinking about defense. In the game, he goes queen to d1. This is a decent move. However, better may have been rook to e1, intending knight to f1 next, and from the f1 square, the knight does a very good job of defending the king side. Instead, queen d1 on the board, black goes queen to f6, again continuing that plan of knight f4, maybe even g5, depending on how aggressive he's feeling. Now here, Magnus has a big problem. The main way he can get counterplay is to strike in the center with the move d4. He definitely doesn't want to sit around and let black's attack build up on the king side with knight f4 and g4. So d4 is going to be the best idea, but how do you prepare it? Unfortunately, right now, the knight and the bishop both control d4. So with that in mind, white goes knight to b3 here, intending d4 next. Now, knight b3 is a decent idea. The only problem behind it is that knight is now further away from the defense of the white king. So with that in mind, black jumps in with the knight to f4. Now, of course, here, white can capture the knight on f4. However, that does give up the very important dark squared bishop. For example, bishop takes, then queen takes. And here, black is going to have excellent attacking chances. Of course, white can force the queens off with the move queen c1. And then after queen c6, the move queen g5. But overall, this is not a very exciting line from white's perspective. So instead, here, Magnus on move 14, instead of bishop takes f4, he goes for the move bishop to e3, simply challenging black's bishop on the a7 square. Now, of course, black does have the option of capturing on the e3 square. However, black does that. Then after f takes e3, that pawn on the e3 square, for example, bishop takes, f takes, that pawn's going to do a great job controlling both the f4 and the d4 squares. And here, white should have something of an advantage. So instead of bishop takes e3 in the game, black does go knight to e7, simply rerouting the knight over to the g6 square. Now here, Magnus, he is fully prepared for that idea breaking in the center with d4. So with that in mind, there's nothing else to do. d4 on the board. And now black here goes knight e to g6. Now, unfortunately, this move may have been a little bit inaccurate. Instead, perhaps the move g5 comes to mind. The idea being you bolster the knight on the f4 square even more, and then the knight can come to g6 behind the pawn, and from there, black's going to have a slightly better attack. And besides g5, of course, even the idea knight to c6 comes to mind. that knight now being better placed to fight for the center now that white already went for the d4 break. Now in the game, black goes knight e to g6, and here Magnus Carlsen, he's starting to think about these bishop takes h3 or knight takes h3 ideas from black. He's got to think about getting his king to safety and perhaps defending the h3 pawn. So with that in mind, here Magnus goes king to h2. Of course, now any sort of bishop sacrifice or knight sacrifice on the h3 square will be met by g takes h3, so very solid idea. Of course, the computer seems to like king to h1 better. The idea behind this move being that the king is a little bit less exposed on h1 versus the h2 square, but both moves very playable. King h2 by Magnus in the game. And here black simply goes c6. Very solid idea. The idea being to expand in the center with the move d5 next. And of course, this is one of the big ideas behind knight e7 to g6, not just improving the placement of the knight, but also setting up these reverse Roy Lopez style ideas with c6 and then d5. Now here, for example, if Magnus Carlsen simply ignores the idea of d5 from black, let's say he goes rook to e1, very solid move. Of course, this f2 pawn being more than sufficiently defended by the bishop on the e3 square, here black can simply strike with the move d5. Now here's the idea. If white takes on the e5 square, black can simply capture back with the knight. Of course, the queen was being attacked by the pawns, that was necessary. And here black's fine. On the other hand, if white takes on the d5 square, then black does not recapture with the pawn. Instead, the key move is actually e4, and this move gains more space in the center and speeds up black's kingside attack. And here, white is going to be under a lot of pressure. So all this to say, white does not want to allow d5 from black without a fight. So instead of rook to e1, here on move 17, Magnus simply takes the pawn on the e5 square, opting to simplify the pawn structure a little bit. Now black takes back with the knight, white takes the knight with his knight, queen takes e5, and now the bishops come off the board. Bishop takes a7, and here the most obvious move for black looks like it should be rook takes a7. I mean, what could be more natural than that? Simply recapturing the bishop right away. Well, instead of that, black finds a better move. That is queen takes e4, and the idea behind this move is white cannot retreat the bishop because black is actually threatening checkmate on the g2 square. Queen takes g2. So marvelous intermediate move by Alireza Firouzja, the aggressive attacking player. Now Magnus, how should he defend against this checkmate threat on the g2 square? Well, Magnus does have a few ideas. First of all, queen to f3 is playable. It does stop the checkmate, but after queen takes g takes, white's pawn structure on the king side is going to be shattered. That is not a very good idea. Instead here, the best move is actually rook to g1. The benefit of this move is it does keep white's pawn structure intact. The other pawns on the f2 and g2 stay right where they are, which does help white's defense in general. Instead here, white actually goes f3, trying to knock back the queen right away. And here black does have the option of recapturing the bishop on a7, but this bishop on c4 is also up for grabs. And here, of course, black's queen is being attacked, so there is no time to take on a7, but fortunately, black can capture the bishop on the c4 square, and that is what he does. Queen takes c4. Now Magnus obviously retreats the bishop, bishop to e3, putting pressure on that knight on the f4 square. Now, things get very complicated here when Alireza Firouzja jumps in with the knight to the d3 square, knight d3, and of course the idea is he is threatening that pawn on the b2 square with the knight. So obviously white cannot allow that. What's he going to do here? In the game, Magnus, instead of defending, he goes knight d2. And of course, now the knight is threatening the queen on c4. Things get very complicated here. Of course, beyond this, there was a stronger move, queen d2 in this position. Now the queen does defend the b2 pawn, and it gives up the defense of the knight on b3. However, black does take that knight. Obviously, now the knight on d3 hangs. White takes this knight, and here white's doing relatively okay. White's pawn on b2 is hanging, but so is black's on d6, and white's going to have a decent endgame. Now, instead of this, on move 22, Magnus Carlsen retreats the knight to the d2 square, of course with the attack on the queen. Black moves the queen to b5, and of course now that attack on the b2 pawn is renewed. So here, this is a blitz game on chess.com, of course, so one of the first rules of blitz, you always want to be the attacker fighting for the initiative. Rather than defending the pawn on b2, here Magnus jumps in with the knight to the e4 square, pressuring the pawn on the d6 square. Now black takes the pawn on b2, threatening the queen. Magnus obviously has to move the queen. Here, instead of simply queen takes d6, the most obvious idea, he goes queen to d4. Now, this move looks a little bit strange to me. I think maybe he was concerned after queen takes d6. Ideas like perhaps bishop to e6, then black threatens rook a d8 with tempo. Perhaps that's what he was concerned about. But overall, queen takes d6, perfectly playable. White's queen is always going to be able to retreat to the c5 square, offering a trade of queens. Magnus here really has nothing to worry about. But instead, queen d4 on the board. Here, black goes queen to e5 check. This virtually forces a trade of the queens. If black wants it, he's going to get it. Now, Magnus takes on e5. Black takes back. And then rook f to b1. So here we have a very complicated Italian endgame. Of course, black is up 2 pawns, but white's pieces overall are a little bit more active here. And Magnus Carlsen does have good compensation, and he is going to create a lot of threats against black. Now here, knight to c4 from Alireza, and bishop c5 from Magnus, simply threatening the rook on the e8 square. Now rook d8, getting the rook on the open file, but then rook b4 from Magnus, once again creating more and more threats. Now here, black defends with the key move, bishop e6. Very typical square for the bishop in the Italian for black, defending the knight on c4. And this is where the endgame gets really interesting. Here, Magnus simply takes the pawn on the b7 square. However, this turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Instead of that, Magnus needs to think about freeing up the c5 square for the knight. With that in mind, the bishop on c5 has to go somewhere. Bishop b6 is very playable. However, black can recapture the bishop. It was not the best idea. Instead, perhaps bishop g1 is the way to go here. Of course, bishop f2 is also playable, but at some point, black may go rook d2, or perhaps knight d2, and after knight takes, then rook takes d2, putting pressure on that bishop. So bishop g1, perhaps a safer square, and from there, Magnus can follow up with knight to c5, pressuring both b7 and the e6 bishop with the knight. However, instead of that, rook takes b7 on the board, very understandable in a blitz game. Here, black goes h6. This move is actually very, very important. Black may be facing various back rank mate threats, so it's a very good idea to give the king the escape square on a7. Now Magnus, bishop b6, pressuring the rook. Black retreats the rook to the b8 square. Rook to e7, keeping the rook alive. And now black takes on b6 and then takes with the rook. And here, once again, Alireza Firouzja is up 2 pawns, the extra pawn on the e file and the a file. However, Magnus is definitely not out. First of all, you never count Magnus out of a game ever. But beyond that, he has some really tricky ideas that I think you're really going to like. These ones shocked me. Here, knight c5, black goes bishop d5, and now Magnus takes the pawn on the e5 square. However, really fast, there's a beautiful tactical idea for Magnus that I just have to show you here. Knight d7 is the move. The idea is you force away the rook. Let's say rook b2. Then you play the deflection move. Rook takes a6. This move, I'm adding 2 exclamation points here. This move deserves it. The idea is you're trying to deflect the rook away from the back rank, and if black takes it, white is actually going to have a perpetual check here. For example, rook takes a6, looks logical, and rook e8, king h7 is forced, then knight to f8, hitting the king and guarding the g6 square. Now the king has to go back. Then you go knight to e6 check, discover check with the rook. The king's forced to go to h7, and then knight to f8 once again is a stalemate. So despite being down material, Magnus could have drawn this immediately with this idea. So really cool moves. Heading back to the game, of course, rook takes e5, played from Magnus here, and now the winning move for black is actually rook to b2. However, this move is hard to find. Instead, here, Alireza goes rook b5. The idea, of course, putting pressure on the knight on the c5 square. However, here, Magnus Carlsen, he finds an excellent idea. Rook takes a6. Now, of course, if black takes the knight, white's going to win the rook on the a8 square, and he's going to have a winning endgame with the 2 rooks versus the rook and the bishop of black. So with that in mind, rewinding, black has to do something. He either takes the rook on the a6 square, or instead in the game, he goes rook to d8. And here in this position, it is even material. Both sides have a rook and a minor piece, and for that reason, in this position, both sides agree to a draw on move 35. Wow, very impressive game. All right, diving into game number 4 of this Magnus Carlsen Italian game special, we have Magnus versus Wesley So from the 2021 FTX Crypto Cup. Now in the game, Magnus won e4 best by test, and of course we head for the Italian game with the move 3, bishop c4. Now from here, both sides follow the standard plan. Knight f6 for Wesley, d3 defending e4, then bishop c5, getting the bishop out to this wonderful diagonal. Now white castles, and here the first surprise of the game. Wesley So actually goes h6 in this game. Now, of course, this does stop knight g5 ideas from white, but this move is technically a little bit premature, and I'm going to show you why. Here, Magnus goes c3, black castles, and then the move b4 from white. So again, this is the key move, the bird's attack. Again, whenever black goes for an early h6 in the Italian, this should always be on your radar as a decent move to play. Here, black does have a choice. Do you want to retreat bishop b6 or bishop b7? Of course, bishop d6 is technically a legal move, but we're not going to talk about that one. It's no good here. Now, bishop b7 makes a lot of sense. Black hasn't gone d6 yet. It looks logical. Black looks very safe and very solid. However, after the move bishop b2 from white, white is going to have a very large advantage. Here, his plan is simply knight d2, perhaps rook e1, and then eventually d4 breaking in the center, and this bishop on b2 is wonderfully placed given that black's bishop on e7 is very passive. And here, black's going to be under a lot of pressure on the king side thanks to white's bishop slicing down the board here. Now, instead of bishop b7, Wesley So did go bishop b6 in the game. So here, bishop b6, retreating the bishop, staying on this diagonal, pointing at the king. And now Magnus plays the strongest idea, a4, of course, threatening a5, the Noah's Ark trap. Black has to respond with either a6 or a5 here. And now, typically, a5 is going to be the move in these kinds of positions. However, here, black has not played the key move d6 yet. Instead, he kind of wasted a tempo on this move h6, and for that reason, white can simply go b5, knocking off the knight. Then after knight d7, white simply goes knight takes e5, winning the pawn. Of course, that pawn being vulnerable because d6 wasn't played yet. So overall, a5, not a good idea from black. Instead here, black has to go a6, guarding the knight on the c6 square. Now b5 is not possible, as black's going to win the rook on a1. After b5, a takes, rook takes. So with that in mind, this pawn on the e5 square is safe for now after the move a6 from black. Now from here, Magnus just continued with normal queenside development as we've seen throughout this series. Knight d2 the move, and black goes d6, bolstering the center with his little pawn chain here. Now Magnus rook d1, again standard stuff, setting up knight f1 to g3, that standard Roy Lopez style maneuver for the knight. Now in this position, black has played most of his normal developing moves except for maybe rook to e8. I mean, this is really the chance where he has to start making a big decision in this game in terms of how he's going to develop. So what are his options here? Well, bishop b6 is actually perfectly playable. Black can go here, challenge the bishop on the c4 square, and if white trades on e6, black recaptures with the pawn. And again, that pawn does control the d5 and f5 squares, and black's going to be relatively okay. Instead, there are a couple of options for the knight. In the game, black goes knight to e7. This turns out to be a little bit imprecise. Instead, the best move for black here might be that move we saw from Alireza Firouzja. That is knight to h5, of course with the idea knight to f4, and perhaps queen to f6 next, trying to increase the pressure on the king side. Now, instead of that, knight to e7 was played in this position from Wesley So, and the problem with this move is it's a little bit slow and it releases the pressure on the d4 square. And this means Magnus Carlsen can jump in with the move d4 immediately, and both of these pawns are perfectly defended here. Now, if black simply leaves the white center alone, let's say he goes knight to g6, a very normal move, here Magnus can simply go h3, stopping bishop g4 ideas, which helps bolster his center further, and here Magnus will have a very solid edge in the Italian. So instead of that, Wesley So does lash out in the center. He starts by taking on the d4 square, e takes d4, Magnus takes back with the c-pawn, and of course knight takes d4 in these kinds of positions is always possible. However, it is a lot less ambitious. White would much rather have those pawns on the d4 and e4 squares. So whenever possible, white is going to try to pull this off. Now here, black does go d5 in this position. We've seen this idea before. However, knight has the nuance of both attacking the pawn on e4 and the bishop on the c4 square. And this is going to require a very precise response from Magnus in this game. Now, the big question is, can you ignore the threat on the bishop? And it turns out you can. The best move here, and the move Magnus plays in the game, is e5, poking at that knight on the f6 square and letting black take on c4 if he wants to. Now, of course, d takes c4 in this position is just suicide. Here's the problem. After d takes c4, then f takes g6, now the black king side is getting blown open as both the knight and the g7 pawn are being attacked. So, for example, here the best move for black might be knight g6, but then white simply takes on g7. Black is kind of forced to go rook to e8, and now after knight takes c4, white is threatening the bishop on the b6 square, and here white has a very large edge. So overall, this move d takes c4, not a very good idea from black. With that in mind, what should he be doing here? Well, the standard idea and the strongest move here for black is knight to e4. Now white has to defend the bishop on c4. You do not want to lose that. Bishop d3 is the move, piling up on the knight with the bishop, the knight, and the rook. Black is forced to take on the d2 square. Knight takes d2. And then here, the most logical idea is bishop takes d2. However, here, you can actually take with the queen, and this is quite a bit stronger, as now the bishop on the c1 square is headed over to the a3 square, and that bishop is going to be a monster if white ever goes b5, with that bishop lining up with the knight and the rook on the e7 and f8 squares. Now, heading back to the game, knight to e4 was not played by black. Instead, knight to h5 was the move. Again, we've seen this idea before. The idea is to follow up with knight to f4, perhaps knight g6, and maybe bringing the queen over to the king side if things open up with this knight on f3 moves. Now here, Magnus simply retreats the bishop back to the f1 square. Bishop f1, very good move. Of course, it was being attacked. It had to go somewhere. And real fast, you can technically go bishop a2 in this position. It's definitely not bad. White's idea with that is he's leaving open the f1 square for the knight. White may go knight to f1. And then the idea could even be bishop b1 and queen d3, setting up that bishop and queen battery on this diagonal, threatening queen to h7 checkmate. So bishop to a2, very playable idea, not super standard in the Italian, but it could be done here. Instead, bishop f1 on the board. Now black jumps in with the knight, knight to f4, then knight to b3 from Magnus. The idea is he wants to jump into the c5 square, knight to c5. And from c5, that knight's going to be a monster. And if black ever takes the knight on c5 with the bishop, white recaptures with the b pawn. And that's going to open up the b file for his rook on the a1 square. And white's going to have a lot of play on the queen side. Now here, black knight e to g6, logical developing move. Now white goes a5, knocking back the bishop to the a7 square. That move is forced. And then here, the strong sequence of moves. First, Magnus Carlsen takes the knight on the f4 square. Bishop takes f4. Now, you normally don't give up the bishop pair as white unless you have a very good reason to do so. And here, Magnus, he does. The knight takes on f4, and then queen d2, pressuring the knight. Now, look at this. Black's two bishops really aren't doing much. The bishop on the a7 square, of course, is biting on granite on d4. The bishop on c8, maybe it can come to f5 or g4, but neither of these squares do a whole lot here. And as we're going to see, if black goes bishop g4, Magnus is going to have these rook lift ideas, rook to a3 or rook to e3, defending along the third rank. So make sure you stick around for that. Here, black, the knight's being attacked. He goes knight to g6, a good move from Wesley So. Of course, there were some alternatives, knight e6, very playable, and even g5 here could be a good move, actually. Instead, knight g6 played in the game, and now Magnus, he continues his idea that he started with knight to b3. He jumps in with the knight to the c5 square, knight c5 on the board, and now that bishop pair is effectively useless. The bishop on a7 doing absolutely nothing. Best case scenario, black may trade the bishop for the knight on the c5 square, but even that wouldn't be very impressive for black. Now here, black has a very critical decision. How do you get counterplay, and where is it going to come from? Well, the strongest move here is probably bishop to g4. You simply have to get that bishop activated and give the rook a chance to get back into the game as well on the d8 square potentially in the future. Now, of course, black is threatening the move bishop takes g3. That would shatter white's pawn structure. White does not want to allow that. Fortunately, Magnus does have some really good rook lift ideas here. For example, rook to e3 is very good, or rook to a3, defending along the third rank, stopping black from giving white double pawns after bishop takes f3. Now, unfortunately for Wesley So, he did not find his idea bishop g4. Instead, f6 was played in the game, and this is a big weakening move. The Ben Feingold counterattack does not work here. Of course, Ben Feingold not a fan of this move, f6, in virtually any position, and here he may be right. In this position, Magnus simply goes bishop d3, redeveloping the bishop on the d3 square and pressuring the knight on g6 that's now vulnerable as the f-pawn no longer defends it. Now here, Wesley finds the best idea, but it's not very impressive, f5. He has to block the attack of the bishop on the knight, but then Magnus here, he gets the better pawn structure. His pawn on the e5 square is now a permanently passed pawn, and black has a very difficult time getting a piece block hitting it on the e6 square. So for all these reasons, the pass pawn, the passive bishop on a7, black's vulnerable knight on g6, black's weak pawn structure on the king side, here Magnus is simply dominating the game despite not being up material. Now from here, Magnus, he just slowly regroups his pieces. There is no rush. He has the permanently better pawn structure. He starts bishop c2, and now black rook e8, and now g3 from Magnus, an excellent move. As you're going to see, this move is connected with various ideas such as knight h4 to g2 to f4. f4 is actually a better square for the knight, and Magnus may also go h4 to h5 at some point, trying to gain more space on the king side and locking in black's weak pawns, all the dark squares. Now here, black finally takes on the c5 square with the bishop. Bishop takes c5. However, after b takes c5, now Magnus has the open b file for the rook, and the rook is going to exert a lot of pressure on the b7 pawn. Now Wesley So does go bishop e6, blockading the pawn on the e5 square. Magnus rook a b1, logical move, attacking b7. Black defends b7 with the rook. And then rook to e3 from Magnus. Excellent rook lift. The idea, of course, is he wants to go rook b3, and from there, both of those rooks will put so much pressure on b7. I mean, already it is getting hard for black to defend his queen side in this game. Now, what should he do about this threat? Well, one idea is simply b6, try to get ahead of white's rook to b3 idea. Now the main line goes a takes, then c takes, then rook e to b3. Black has to block the queen side with the move b5, but then Magnus Carlsen can reroute knight to e1. Of course, the idea is knight g2 to f4 at some point. And again, Magnus Carlsen is simply dominating the game here. Black's pass pawns on the queen side look dangerous, but Magnus currently has them totally under control. Now, instead of b6, in the game, Wesley So does play the move knight to e7. Now, this move is more solid, and of course, his idea after rook e to b3 is to defend the pawn on the b7 square with the queen going to c8. So queen c8 is the move, defending b7 with the rook and the queen. But now Magnus starts his idea of rerouting the knight to the f4 square, starting with knight to h4. Then after rook f8, knight g2 from Magnus. Again, knight to f4 is the idea typically in these positions. Now, black goes bishop d7 here, getting out of the way of knight to f4 from Magnus. However, Wesley So also has the idea of going bishop to a4, threatening the rook on the b3 square and x-ray attacking the bishop on the c2 square. So very creative idea. Now here, Magnus, you should probably go bishop d3. The idea is after bishop to a4, that rook can move and white doesn't lose that very important light-squared bishop. However, instead of that, he immediately expands on the king side with the move h4. And of course, the problem with this move is Wesley So here simply goes rook to a4, skewering the rook. Rook 3b2 is sort of forced. Now bishop takes c2. And black did successfully trade one pair of minor pieces, which is definitely to his advantage in this position. Now here, the best move from white is going to be a rook takes c2. The idea is you are giving up the two rooks on the open b file. However, the queen does maintain control of the f4 square, and that's going to be super important. However, Magnus did not play that in the game. Instead, queen takes c2 was the move. But again, now the queen gives up control of that f4 square. And black's going to have various threats here based on the move f4. And believe it or not, f4 immediately actually works for black. Now, the idea behind this is if white takes with the g-pawn, black's going to crash through with the queen to the g4 square. Of course, f4 was the clearance move, getting this diagonal open for the queen. However, instead of that, if white did knight takes f4, then black has the ridiculous idea rook takes f4, giving up the rook. Then after g takes, once again, black jumps in with the queen to the g4 square. And then after king to f1, black goes rook to f8. And here, black has a very big initiative on the king side. So that is the whole problem with that move queen takes c2 instead of rook takes c2 that we saw earlier. However, here black does not punish it, but instead of f4, here black simply goes knight to c6, rerouting the knight potentially to d8, then e6. It's a good idea, just a little bit slow. Now, once again, queen d2 is the best move, both defending the d4 pawn and defending the f4 square. Instead, queen c3 on the board. And here, once again, black can actually go f4 right away with the same ideas, following up queen to g4. However, Wesley So does not find it. Instead, g5 on the board. However, this move is quite a bit weaker, and Magnus does find the best idea for white here is simply to take on g5. Then after h takes, the move is f4, trying to lock down the king side. Now, if black goes g4, that'll be perfectly fine for white. White's going to have a great game after g4, then knight to e3, pressuring both the d5 and the f5 pawns with the knight. Now, instead of that, king to g7 was played by Wesley So, and here Magnus simply king to f2, just kind of biding his time. Now, rook h8 from Wesley, good idea, getting the rook out onto the open h-file. But then f takes g5 from Magnus, excellent move. The idea, of course, is opening up the king side where he has more space. Knight to f4 is an idea, and overall, Magnus has an excellent game here. Now, Wesley rook to h2, Magnus swings his queen over to the king side, queen to f3, both defending in the future and attacking f5. Not the most precise move, but certainly good enough here. Now, Wesley So does see a free pawn on d4. He takes it. However, Magnus can take the pawn on the d5 square now. Queen takes d5 on the board. Now, of course, the knight is being attacked. It has to go somewhere in the game. Knight c6 is the move. And here, Magnus goes for the finishing blow. e6. Then after queen d8 from Wesley So, he jumps in with the queen d7 check. Now after queen takes, e takes, that passed pawn is an absolute menace. And black tries to get ahead of it, rook d8, but then rook d2 from Magnus simply defends. And look at this rook on the h2 square, doing absolutely nothing here. Now Wesley knight to e5, trying to put more pressure on that pawn on the e7 square, but Magnus, he's on top of it. He simply takes on b7, and then after king g6 from black, he takes on c7, and here in this position, Wesley So resigns to Magnus Carlsen as he is simply down 3 pawns without any compensation for it. Wow, very impressive game by Magnus Carlsen. All right, diving into our last game, it is Magnus Carlsen versus Vishy Anand from the 2024 Casablanca chess tournament. Now in the game, Magnus opens 1e4, best by test. And of course, Vishy replies e5. Then we have knight f3, knight c6, and bishop c4, the Italian game on the board. Now here, Vishy responds bishop c5, typical Italian move. And in this series so far, we've seen black play all of the mainline Italian openings, a5, a6, and bishop b6. We've seen all of those moves so far in spades, but in this game, Magnus Carlsen mixes things up with the Evans Gambit with the move 4b4. Now, this is an old school opening. This was invented a long time ago. White's idea is very simple. He sacrifices that pawn on the b4 square. However, in exchange, he gains time to build his beautiful pawn center with the moves c3 and d4. So, for example, black takes on b4 in the game, then white goes c3, obviously. Now the bishop is being attacked, and white's idea is to go d4 next. And from there, he'll have dominant control of the center. So this opening is very similar in that regard to the king's gambit. White is sacrificing a pawn in order to speed up his ability to gain control of the center with d4 and e4. Now here, black does have a choice. Where do you want to retreat the bishop? And moving the bishop is necessary. Now the main moves here are bishop to e7 and bishop to a5. Bishop e7 is the more solid move. However, bishop a5 is more ambitious. It is stronger according to the computer. As from there, the bishop does still line up with the white king, and it can also go to b6, a very good diagonal for the bishop as we've seen in this series. Now from here, bishop a5 on the board from Vishy Anand, and here Magnus Carlsen simply castles. Of course, d4 was possible here. However, there are some complicated lines. Obviously, if black takes on the d4 square, white can't immediately capture back as that pawn is pinned. However, white does have some interesting ideas with queen b3, followed by short castles. And of course here, black's forced to defend the pawn on the f7 square, giving white a continued initiative. Now, heading back to the game, short castles was played by white on move 6, short castles on the board. And if you made it this far, trust me, you want to watch until the very end of this game. This last game features a double, maybe even a triple rook sacrifice by Magnus. That is the main reason I picked this game as the last one in this series. And if you don't believe me, if you don't believe a triple rook sacrifice is possible given white only has 2 rooks, just stick around. You might be surprised. Maybe it's a double rook sacrifice. It's kind of hard to say. You'll see why. All right, here, Vishy Anand, queen to f6 is his move. This move's a little bit weird looking. I mean, after all, typically black wants to bring the knight out to the f6 square, and now that's not possible. Black's going to have to go knight to e7 instead. But on the other hand, this move does put additional pressure on that d4 pawn. Obviously, the queen does support the e takes d4 idea if white ever goes d4 himself. Now here, Magnus is not afraid. He's not seeing ghosts. He simply breaks in the center with the move d4, ignoring black's idea. potentially going e takes d4 with pressure on the d4 square. Now black knight g to e7, the best developing move for the knight. Black has to castle somehow. And now bishop g5 from Magnus Carlsen, simply putting pressure on the queen on the f6 square. And now where's the queen gonna go? Well, queen d6 played in the game, decent move. And now Magnus shows another key idea in this Evans gambit and in the Italian in general, queen b3. You've seen this move before. Obviously, the main idea of this in the Italian is it does synergize with the bishop, putting pressure on the f7 square, and beyond that, eyeing the b7 square, which could be useful in the future. Now, real fast, queen b3 was not the strongest idea. There was a stronger move, and I have to show you it because there's a beautiful idea behind it. Here, white's best move is actually knight d2. And yes, this move does give up that pawn on the c3 square. However, white has some very beautiful tactics that take advantage of white's placement of his knights and black's placement of his queen on d6, which is quite unusual in the Italian. Obviously, typically black's going to have a pawn there. So here's the idea. If black takes on c3, then white actually sacrifices the bishop. Bishop takes f7. Now, this is actually a clearance move. White wants to be able to go knight to c4 here. So black takes with the king, the best move for black. Then the idea is knight to c4, and then after the queen moves, obviously the queen's being attacked. Then white's going to jump in with the knight on f3, taking e5 with check, and white's going to have a continued attack. Obviously the knight's very strong on c4 and the future e5 square, and f3 will be available for the queen. This is going to be incredibly dangerous for black. And white's going to have plenty of time to eventually go rook to c1, getting out of the attack of the bishop on the c3 square. So really cool idea. Magnus did not see it in the game or chose not to play it for whatever reason. Instead, queen to b3 on the board from Magnus. Now here, the threat obviously is bishop takes f7. Black's going to have to defend against that somehow. Short castles was played by Vishy Anand. And now here, Magnus simply rook d1, further defending that pawn on d4. Threatening various d takes e5 ideas. Obviously then, if black takes with the knight, this rook is going to be lining up with the queen. That's going to be a disaster, so black does have to be careful here. Now, real fast, instead of rook d1, there was another move. d5 may have been a little bit stronger. This move here particularly strong as it takes advantage of black's weird coordination of his pieces. Obviously, typically black would want to be able to go knight to a5 here, but that's not possible. Knight e7 is not possible because that knight on there covers that square. This knight's going to have to go somewhere like b8 or d8, and overall, white's going to have a nice space advantage and good pressure, but instead, rook d1 on the board from Magnus. Now here, black goes bishop b6. Very logical move, obviously increasing the pressure on the d4 square. E takes d4 is now a bigger threat, and black could follow up with ideas like knight to e5. That move would fork both the queen and the bishop on the c4 square, and if white loses his white-squared bishop, that's going to really hurt his attacking chances in this game. Now here, Magnus, what is he going to do about this idea of knight to a5 from black? In the game, he actually ignores the threat, simply goes knight to a3. The idea behind this move is white would really want to go knight c3, but that's not possible. Knight d2 blocks the rook's communication with the d4 square. That may be problematic for white. So by constellation, knight to a3, and from here the knight does threaten knight b5. That could be useful in some situations, and if the bishop ever moves, knight c4 is also possible. So overall, decent square for the knight. Now here, black does go knight to a5, as we talked about, threatening both the queen and the bishop. Black trying to get that light square bishop off the board no matter what. However, here, after knight to a3 from white, this move isn't really as strong. Here, white simply goes queen to a4, getting out of the attack. And now here, black takes the bishop on c4. White can simply recapture with the knight, and then white's going to be piling up on that pawn on the e5 square. White's going to have a terrific game. So this whole idea from black isn't really proving to work very well here. Now black, knight e to c6 is the move. The idea being, of course, trying to reroute that knight from the e7 square to a better place. So not a bad idea, but black is still facing a lot of coordination issues. Just look at his queen side, all of these pieces bunched up here. Obviously, the bishop on c8 and the rook on a8 also very out of play for now. Now here, the best idea for white, once again, is going to be d5, again, capitalizing on the very strange coordination of black's pieces. However, instead of that, here Magnus does go d takes e5. And of course, the idea of this move is that black takes on e5 with the knight. That just loses the queen on the spot, so that is not a viable option. The queen can't take on e5 because the knight defends it. Therefore, the queen has to move, and then later black has to think about taking back on the e5 square. So the big question is, where should the queen go? Well, the best move in this position for black is simply queen g6, putting pressure on that bishop on g5. Now black's threat is actually knight takes e5, and if white takes back with the knight, that removes the defender of the bishop. Black can simply take the bishop with the queen. So queen g6, best move for black. Instead of that, Vishy Anand goes queen to c5. Now, the idea behind this move, obviously, is black is threatening that pawn on the f2 square. Here, black simply threatens queen takes f2 check. What is Magnus going to do about it? I mean, if I was here as white, I would have immediately thought, how do I defend that? But Magnus Carlsen, he calculates everything all the way through. Instead of defending, he goes rook d5, a very ballsy move, begging black to take on the f2 square, and that is what Vishy Anand does. Obviously, there is no good retreat square here. Black's all in. You can't go queen d7. The bishop controls that, and literally every other square is controlled by white. That's the big problem with this move, queen to c5 from black. If he goes there and white goes rook d5, black is literally all in. So now queen c5, rook d5, and then queen takes f2 from black. Now, obviously, the only legal move for white is king to h1, not a very hard move to find. But now black, what's he supposed to do about his queen stuck on the f2 square? Obviously, white's going to have various ideas to try to win it. Perhaps bishop to h4, threatening the queen. Perhaps rook d2 ideas at some point. Maybe this rook can get into the game on e1, then e2. I mean, black's queen in a lot of trouble here. Well, in the game, Vishy goes queen b2. This turns out to be a big mistake. But now rook b1 from Magnus, simply hitting the queen. And now what is black supposed to do? I mean, you can go back to the f2 square, but from there it's likely going to get trapped sooner or later from white. Rook d2 ideas, rook to f1 ideas, and so on. Now here, Vishy Anand, he actually gives up the queen. And what does he get in return? He gets the knight here, queen takes a3, white takes the queen, then black takes the bishop on the c4 square. So far, 2 minor pieces. He's also up 1 pawn. So in the end, black gets 2 minor pieces plus a pawn for the queen. Is that enough? Well, not quite. Here, Magnus, queen to a4, simply putting pressure on the knight. And again, all of white's pieces are out and active, but black's queen side, especially the bishop and the rook, are not. This is not looking good. Here, Vishy Anand goes knight to e3, threatening the rook on the d5 square. Of course, if white takes with the bishop, black can capture back with the bishop here, and he's still technically in the game. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he demonstrates why he is the greatest chess player of all time, and he plays a series of moves that is either a double rook sacrifice or a triple rook sacrifice. It's very hard to say. And again, watch this one, then let me know what you think. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen, he sacrifices the rook. Rook takes b6, rook sacrifice number 1. Obviously, the bishop on b6 was defending the knight on the e3 square. Once you remove the bishop, then bishop takes e3 is a legitimate threat, winning that piece. So here, a rook sacrifice number 1. But then black can obviously take either rook. Here, Vishy Anand takes the rook on the d5 square. Is that rook sacrifice number 2? It might be. Here, the threat, obviously, if white takes on d5, black can take back with the c-pawn, and here black's very much in the game. So instead of that, here, Magnus Carlsen in this position sacrifices the rook. Is that the third rook sacrifice? Let me know if you agree. I think it might be. Rook takes c6. The idea, obviously, if black takes anywhere, let's say b takes c6, white takes the knight, and in this position, white is absolutely dominating. What about the alternatives? If black takes back with the d-pawn, same thing. E takes d5. And here Magnus has the queen and the knight for the rooks that aren't active. Black's going to get blown off the board once again. There are some other tricky moves here. Obviously, if black goes rook to e8, simply a waiting move, white's going to go rook c5, keeping the rook alive, pressuring the knight on the d5 square, white wins. Finally, the last tricky move from black is going to be b5. Now, this move is very interesting. Here, if white takes on b5, black is actually still in the game. Here's why. Black goes d takes c6. Now the knight on c6 knight on d5 is being defended, and this pawn attacks the queen. And if white takes the pawn, then knight to b6, and this move keeps the knight alive, and it keeps that rook on a8 alive. And here black actually has drawing chances, believe it or not. However, instead of queen takes b5, in this position right here, Magnus can simply go queen to c2, and once again, the same thing's going to happen. Something like d takes c6, then e takes d5, and here, once again, Magnus Carlsen is going to clean up and win. And for that reason, once Magnus Carlsen played the finishing move, rook takes c6, sacrificing the second or maybe the third rook, depending on how you want to count it. In this position, Vishy Anand resigned on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game by Magnus, and what a series of games by Magnus Carlsen in the Italian game as white. A very strong opening for white, one of the most popular openings at the highest level. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do me a huge favor, like this video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my other videos in the Magnus Carlsen playlist. And by the way, if there are other openings you want to see me cover, or other players playing specific openings, maybe a specific opening by Magnus, or Hans Niemann, or Hikaru, or any other of the top players, let me know in the comment section below. I'll be checking them out and reading them. And if I like your idea, I'll make sure to do a video on that player and that opening. And I'll see you in the next video.